Dennis had almost lost all hope after spending the entire day fishing without catching anything. He had been fishing in these waters for years, but the tug he felt on his line this time was different. It was strong. With trepidation, he realized what he had caught. He wished he had never started pulling, and he knew he should have left it alone. Dennis and his fellow fishermen looked at their catch in complete disbelief. Neither of them had ever seen anything like this before. Dennis didn't know what to do with the monster he'd just caught. Just tossing it back into the water did not seem right. They wanted a closer look at the creature, but it started acting aggressively toward them when they tried. Dennis was freaking out. He wanted to throw it back into the water, but just as he was about to throw it, he noticed something that could explain what this bizarre creature was. When Dennis was sure about what he saw, tears lit up in his eyes. He immediately called the police. Everybody needed to know about his discovery. But what creature had Dennis pulled out from the water? How had it gotten there? And why did this discovery bring Dennis to tears? Dennis has been fishing with his granddad since he only was 5 years old. He has been a fishing enthusiast ever since, and by this point, he believed he had caught everything the seas had to offer, but this one catch would turn his whole world upside down. What was so surprising was that he caught the monster at his favorite fishing spot. Dennis and his granddad have caught thousands of fish here, but they've never caught anything like this. Sadly, his granddad wasn't here anymore to see Dennis's greatest catch. Dennis often went on his fishing trip with one or more of his buddies. They would drive their small boat out to a location and spend all day together. But today, on the death day of his granddad, none of his friends were available. Going out onto the water alone was not an option. It could be dangerous if something goes wrong and you are all alone. You would need somebody there. But Dennis needed a distraction today, so he ensured he could go out onto the water that day. Dennis ran out of options, so he ended up posting an invitation on a forum board for local fishermen, asking if somebody wanted to join him out on the water today. And luckily, it did not take long before he got a reaction. Dennis got a message in his inbox from a fisher who had only joined the forum 2 weeks ago. He would have liked to find somebody with more experience, but nobody else reacted, and Dennis really didn't want to be alone today, so this rookie would have to do. Dennis would pick up the rookie in a bar the next town over, and then they would drive to one of his favorite spots. In remembrance of his granddad, Dennis wanted to go to their favorite spot. He was always guaranteed a couple of good catches here, and he thought this might be fun for the rookie. After an hour of driving, Dennis finally arrived at the bar. He walked inside and instantly felt very uncomfortable. He wanted to find the rookie and leave this place as soon as possible. But suddenly, chills ran down his spine and his heart started racing. It felt like he was being watched. Dennis wanted to stay and wait for the rookie, but the longer he stayed, the more unsafe he felt. Finally, he couldn't stand the feeling anymore. Dennis decided to leave the bar and get back to the car, but when he stood up and tried to leave, he noticed someone was following him. As he walked to the exit, he heard footsteps coming behind him. Dennis quickly ran back to the car and tried to get the keys out of his pocket. But just when he was about to unlock the car, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Who is this guy? Dennis turned around in fear and saw a casually dressed middle-aged man with a beard. "Hey, I've been looking for you," the stranger said. Dennis couldn't stand it anymore. "Who are you and why are you following me?" "I'm so sorry if I scared you. I am Drake, the rookie from the forum. I get so nervous around new people. I didn't know how to approach you, so I was just sitting in the bar until I saw you leave." Dennis got a weird feeling about this guy. It all sounded like an odd lie. And besides, Drake doesn't even look like a fisher. After getting to know each other better, Drake told Dennis that he didn't have much fishing experience, but he felt like this was his passion. Dennis told him he would teach him a thing or two. Dennis still didn't completely trust Drake, but maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Drake started telling Dennis about his newly found great fishing career on the ride over to the lake. Drake began to brag about his skills and told Dennis all about how he should be fishing and what rods and lures he needed to use. "Maybe one day you will be as great as I am," he said. Dennis tried to be nice, but he was getting more and more annoyed at the rookie. Who did he think he was, trying to tell him what to do? Dennis had been fishing for over a decade. He learned all his skills from the greatest fisherman he knew, his granddad. There was no better teacher than him, right? When they got to the water, they unloaded the boat together, which surprisingly went really smoothly. It seemed like Drake had finally stopped trying to be the expert, but Dennis wasn't ready to let it go just yet. Drake had something waiting for him. Out on the water, Dennis was ready to show that he didn't need any advice from anyone. He wanted to show off who's the real fishing expert amongst them. But this did not go to plan at all. Dennis was embarrassing himself and his granddad with what he did next. While Drake was reeling in fish after fish, Dennis could not even get a guppy on the boat. How is this possible? Dennis always caught the biggest fish here, but maybe he wasn't as good as he thought he was. Perhaps he needed his granddad more than he thought he would. Drake really needed to pee, but as they were on a small wooden fisherman's boat, there was no toilet. He had no choice but to pee off the other side of the ship, so he did. While Drake was peeing, Dennis quickly went through his fishing gear. Surprisingly, most of it seemed familiar to him, but this one particular thing really stood out. Drake had a few really odd-looking lures Dennis had never seen before. Could this be what gave him all the success? But then he heard Drake coming back from the front of the boat. Without looking, Dennis quickly grabbed one of those unique lures. As Drake was pulling in another catch just minutes later, Dennis quickly changed his lure to the one he stole from Drake. While Dennis was putting it on, he took a closer look at it. It looked so weird. He could not imagine getting even one fish with this. Dennis didn't know he minutes away from the greatest catch ever. It only took a few minutes before something started pulling on Dennis's line, and it started pulling hard. He was so caught off guard by it, he almost let his pole slip. He had never experienced anything like this before. How was this possible? Dennis regained his composure just in time and started fighting the fish. This was bigger, heavier, and stronger than anything he had caught before. Dennis began to think this could be the biggest monster he had ever caught. And he was right. Dennis's hands and arms were sore from fighting the fish. Dennis started wondering what he could have possibly hooked that would put up such a fight. Neither of them had ever experienced anything like this before. This kind of strength did not come from any creature known to man. Dennis didn't want to admit it, but to get the fish out of the water, he needed Drake's help to steer the boat in the right direction. Drake didn't hesitate a second and jumped to the steering wheel. They were working together like they had been a duo for years. Dennis tried to hold on to his rod, but the monster was pulling too hard. Dennis didn't want to admit it, but he realized he couldn't do it alone. So he shouted to Drake, "What are you doing? Come over here and help me!" With Drake's help, he managed to reel in the final meters of line. After battling the monster for half an hour, they finally caught a glimpse of the horrifying creature. Drake got the shock of his life and let go of the rod. Drake quickly ran back to the steering wheel and sailed away. Minutes later, he realized Dennis wasn't on the boat anymore. He must have fallen off the boat when Drake let go of the rod. Drake quickly turned the boat around in the hope of finding his friend. Drake sailed back to where they were before, but there was no sign of Dennis. Drake started stressing out. What if the monster has gotten him? He needed to find Dennis as soon as possible. Just when he was about to give up all hope, he saw something floating in the distance. It was Dennis. Drake quickly sailed towards him and pulled Dennis out of the water. Dennis was pissed and yelled, "How could you ever leave me alone?" He still wanted to chase the monster. They are way too invested to just let it go now. "It's your fault we lost the monster, and besides that, you almost got me killed," Dennis yelled at Drake. "I should have never taken a rookie with me. I knew you weren't ready for this." Drake was overwhelmed with a feeling of guilt. "We will find back your rod and reel in the biggest catch of your life. I promise." They were determined to find the rod and the monster that was hopefully still hooked onto it. Dennis told Drake where he saw the rod a few minutes ago, and surely, after a few minutes of searching, they found his rod floating in the sea. They caught the rod and managed to get it out of the water. The line started racing again as soon as they got a hold of it. The monster was still hooked. This time, they both committed to reeling it in, and they succeeded. After an hour-long battle, they got the monster to the surface. This time, they worked together like the power duo they were meant to be. They couldn't believe their eyes when they finally got the beast out of the water. Dennis had to know what kind of creature this was. But when they tried to inspect the animal, it started acting aggressively. Then, all of a sudden, it bit Dennis, and it bit hard. Out of shock, he threw it back into the water, but it wasn't hooked anymore this time. Dennis's arm started to swell up, and it even turned purple after a minute. Dennis fell to the ground. "Drake, I don't feel so good." Drake ran to the first aid kit, but there was nothing in there that could possibly help Dennis. They have to get immediate help before it's too late. Drake immediately called the Coast Guard. He explained everything, and even sent him pictures of Dennis's arm and the monster. They told them to stay put and try not to panic. All available emergency services are on the way. After 30 long minutes, the Coast Guards arrived. Dennis has already turned completely pale. They told Drake that they won't get back in time if they traveled by boat. That's why an emergency helicopter is already on its way to get them to the hospital. The helicopter finally arrived. With the help of the Coast Guards, they got pulled up. Dennis started feeling dull. He just wanted to rest his eyes for a minute. "Hey buddy, everything's going to be all right. I'm right here. Dennis, stay with us. Hey!" Dennis woke up in the hospital and saw a policeman standing beside him. He looks at his arm, and surprisingly, everything is okay. But then, all kinds of thoughts and questions started racing through his head. What happened? He told the officer that Dennis and Drake had found a very rare fish species, and because there is no anti-venom for his bite, this is one of the most venomous fish on the record. But if there is no anti-venom, how did Dennis survive? The officer told him that he had gotten a blood transfusion from his friend. That blood transfusion saved his life. Dennis asked where Drake was, but the officer said there was no Drake, not even in the helicopter. The officer explained to Dennis why he was there. Dennis had made the discovery of the century. This fish has rarely ever been seen, and there are no survivors of its bite on the record. The media is waiting outside for an interview. The officer is with him for an escort. Dennis wanted to get ready to go outside and asked if the officer would leave the room for some privacy. So Dennis got changed, and just as we were about to leave, he noticed a letter underneath the chair's pillow. Dennis opens the letter, and Drake explains everything in the letter. His actual name is James. He told Dennis that he was his long-lost brother and had been searching for him for years. When James moved to this town, he already gave up hope, but then he saw his ad on a fisher forum. James and Dennis were separated when their parents got divorced. Dennis was only 2 years old when they did, so he didn't remember anything from that time. Dennis got sent to his granddad, and James stayed with their birth mother. Their father wasn't in the picture anymore. Ever since James has been looking for Dennis, he always felt like Dennis was near. When James finally found Dennis, he felt like he wasn't good enough for his little brother, so he left town as soon as possible. Dennis felt guilty for yelling at James before and hoped to see him again one day.